It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Lisa Johnson, Horticulture Educator, UW-Madison Division of Extension in Dane County. Lisa, take it away.
Thanks, Peggy. Tree planting is a very timely topic because fall is a great time for planting at least some varieties of trees. If you want to check out which ones you should and should not plant, we do have a mini webinar that we did, I believe, the previous week, and you can find that on the Wisconsin Horticulture site. So this is what we all hope that our trees will grow up to be: big, beautiful, and healthy. But we need to make sure that in order for them to get there, that we plant them properly and give them a good footing, so to speak. So everything that I'm going to be talking about is on this publication that I put together for the Tree Canopy Collaborative. And you can find it on the Wisconsin Horticulture site. I've also included a QR code for those of you who might have your phone with you right now, and you can download that. So this is the outline of what I'll be talking about. I will be going through the 5 steps to plant a tree, but I also will throw in a pre-step about identifying the planting site. But other than that, I will pretty much follow this outline where we talk about the 5 steps and go into them in a little bit of detail. So the pre-step is the right plant, right place. That's making sure that the tree that you've chosen at the nursery actually matches the environment that you have. Whether it's a sunny area, shady area, some of each, what the soil type is, whether it has good drainage or poor drainage, what the pH is, which is a measure of alkalinity and acidity, the mature tree size, and keep in mind too that when you plant a tree someplace where its roots can't spread, that may have an effect on its eventual health. I do also recommend, if you haven't had the soil tested where you're going to plant your tree, it's a really good idea to get it tested at the soils lab, and that will give you a lot of valuable information about your trees as well. And also remember, when you're choosing your spot, to look up and make sure that there aren't any overhead utilities that are going to cause problems. Now, there might also be utilities below ground, and we will talk about that in just a second, but I want to give a little bit more detail about that root thing that I was talking about. So 90% of a tree's roots are in the top 12 inches of soil, and they spread a lot farther than most people think that they will. So it hurts me when I see trees in little parking lot islands that I know are going to have a really tough time. It can stunt their growth, it can shorten their lifespan. Also, making sure that you don't plant on a septic field or too close to a home where roots might interfere with your pipes or your foundation. So here then is the step 1 of the 5 steps, call Digger's Hotline. And that will give you the location of any underground utilities. It's really easy to do. They're open 24/7, 365, and you can either call them or you can do the online registration as well. It'll take them 1 to 3 days to come out and do the marking. And technically the marking only lasts for 10 days before they make you redo it if you haven't gotten your tree in the ground by then. Not that you're probably likely to add any utilities in that time, but that's just what their rules are for marking. So it's really easy to do, doesn't take very much time, and they ask you some entertaining questions like, will you be using dynamite to dig your hole? All right, so step 2 then is find the root flare. This is a critical step. So the root flare is this bulge that occurs between the stem and the roots, the trunk and the roots. And be careful not to confuse a graft with a flare. So the flare actually flares out. Sometimes it's also called a root collar, and there are some other similar terms that you might see, but we're going to refer to it as a root flare. But you can see that the root flare looks pretty much the same in all the different media. We might buy our tree bare root if we're planting in spring. If we're planting this fall, we might be buying potted or balled and burlapped. Bare root trees are only available in spring, but they're really great for being able to see the root system that you're buying, which after all is an important part of the tree. Now, some trees are going to be grafted, and that means that they have a trunk and branches that are grafted onto the root stock of a different plant. And any named variety, for the most part, will be grafted. So I expect that probably quite a lot of you will have grafted trees, and it's important not to mistake that graft for the root flare. And here's a little bit of a picture of what that would be like. You can clearly see where the stem got joined to the root system, and you can still see the root flare below that. So just in case you were waiting till spring to plant a bare root tree, I wanted to show you what a picture of a good healthy root system might look like. And you can very easily see in this picture where the graft is, where the scion meets the root stock, and then you can see where that root flare is. And it's important to identify the root flare because you're going to plant right above where that root flare starts. You want to see just a little bit of that flare and where the roots come out when you plant that tree. Especially if you have heavy soils, it's really important not to plant too deeply. And you can see here from these photos, all of those trees are grafted. You can see the graft, and you can also see where the root flare is. Now, maybe you're going to get your tree in a pot. That's all fine and dandy too. Sometimes, however, you may find that you can't see the root flare, and we'll be talking about what to do. Ideally, if you cannot see the root flare on a tree, whether it's potted or balled and burlapped, I would avoid buying that tree if you can possibly help it. Now, in a balled and burlap tree, you should also have the root flare at the top of the ball, but quite often we end up with this sort of situation on the right, where you have the root flare kind of buried within the burlap, and you really can't see where it is. And that can be problematic, and we'll talk about why in just a second. So what the big hairy deal about root flares are is that they're the oldest part of the tree, and they have a really important role in storage, but also in anchoring the tree and providing support. They mark a transition between trunk tissue and root tissue, and they should not be buried. The trees on the left were probably planted by squirrels or by the tree themselves. The tree on the right next to the telephone pole might have been planted by a human, or it might have been planted by a squirrel. But I included that picture so that you can see if a tree goes straight into the ground like a telephone pole, if there's no flare at the bottom, that tree has been planted too deep, and that can cause a whole bunch of problems, girdling roots and so on. And I will show you some of those. These are girdling roots. They happen when the tree is planted too deep and the roots try and get up into the oxygen layer, and they can wrap around the trunk and end up causing structural problems, and like this, trunk compression, but also eventually strangling the tree. That compression can also cause cracks in the trunk. You can also have things happen like early fall color, decline symptoms, which include thinning canopy, that early fall color, the slower growth, smaller leaves, and eventual death of the tree. The picture on the right, the two trees are the same variety planted at the same time, one of them planted correctly and the other one not. Here's the other thing that can happen when the root flare gets buried. You can end up sometimes with a ball and joint break where the tree breaks off right at the root flare. Okay, so if you did happen to buy a containerized tree and you didn't know to look for the root flare, or somebody bought it for you, you need to go through that root ball and try and find it. And that can mean taking out a lot of the root system, but it is better than actually leaving the tree to deal with girdling roots as it gets older. You can see when trees are left in containers too long, you can end up with circling roots like that. So you can see how deep this was planted and how much of the actual root system is there. Definitely with bare root trees, you're going to want to stake them because this is not a very stable structure there. If with B&B trees, keep in mind that 50 to 90% of the roots were removed when the plant was put in the ball. And the root flare often gets covered due to various processes that go on in the nursery. So often there are B&B trees will have it buried. Here's an example of a tree. It could have been one that was in a container, because sometimes you see that too. If you have very large circling roots, you should remove them and then loosen the tight roots. If the bottom is a solid mass of roots, you can cut those off and then loosen the roots up from there. Really important to do that. Here's an example of what that looked like. You find out that the tree is not only buried here, but they buried the graft, and then way below that even was the root flare. Here's another example from Tennessee Technical College, where they did this, and they said it looked healthy in the ball, but once they found the root flare, there was hardly any root system at all. So it's really important when you buy B&B or containerized, again, to look for that root flare at the surface. Now, once you've located the root flare, then you're going to measure from the root flare to the bottom of the root ball to determine the depth of the hole. And you want that hole to be wide. You want it to be 3 to 5 times the diameter of that root ball. And then you're going to set that root ball on the floor of the hole and not add any kind of soil amendments. So this is the kind of hole we don't want to see. First of all, we can't see the root flare, and they've dug the hole prior to finding the root flare. So the hole may very well be too deep, but it's also not wide enough. And they left down the rope and burlap, so that should not be done either. So when you measure, you know then how deep to make your hole, and you want to make sure that root flare is at the top of the surface, kind of slope and roughen the sides, and then again, set directly on the bottom of the hole. If it's in a balled and burlapped, you might want to have the thing set on a tarp and then kind of slide it into the hole carefully. And then once it's in the hole, remove the ropes and the burlap and wires if present. Okay, so step 4 then, we've dug our hole, we got our tree in the hole, and again, you want to remove that wire basket. Separate the roots out if they're circling, and ideally you would have done that already when you found the root flare, but you can also do that once it's in the hole. Make sure as you're filling in that it's a good idea to water it in thirds so that you allow the soil to settle, and you kind of use your fingers to make sure that you're eliminating air pockets. So you do that in thirds until you're up to the top of the soil where your root flare is. And at that point, you've got your tree planted, but there are still other things you'll need to do to finish up. So step 4 then is what happens if you leave your tree in the hole with the burlap on. You can see that it really doesn't decay as well as one might hope, especially if it's polypropylene burlap. They don't use that too much anymore, but often burlap is treated so that it doesn't disintegrate very fast. And so that can strangle the tree. And you can see this tree was also deep planted because it's got circling roots here. This poor tree, they left the ropes on. You can see the ropes are still there digging into the trunk. You can see that the cage, the wire cage, they may tell you that the wire cage is going to rust away. Well, let me tell you, it really doesn't. At least not in a fashion that will help the tree at any point. Often we see tree roots getting strangled by the wire cages. So definitely remove all of that. Okay, so once you finished your watering, make sure that that soil that you had filled the hole with, that should all be native soil from the site. You should not bring in good soil to improve the soil that you have there. You should buy a tree that can handle the soil that you've got. And the reason for that is that if you have good soil in your hole and not so good soil around it, the tree roots won't explore that soil very much. They will continue to go around and around in the hole, and that's not good for the tree at all. So do make sure that you complete that step. And finally, step 5, finish up. You want to build a little soil saucer, which is kind of a narrow ring type berm, at least 3 inches high around the edge of the hole as a water reservoir. Believe me, you will thank me for this when you water it and the water sinks in instead of runs off. And so you should fill that with water and let it drain. And then you should mulch. We really do recommend mulch for a couple of reasons that I'll talk about in just a second. You do also, though, want to make sure that mulch is not too deep, 2 to 3 inches max. And it also should not touch the trunk. Now, some small trees may need staking, others will not. We encourage you that if the tree is, say, 1.5 inches in diameter, unless it was bare root, you probably would not need to stake that tree. But if you do need to, you want to have 2 opposing stakes outside the bounds of the root mass, and you want them to be staggered so they're not at the same place, and they should have a lot of give. The reason for that is that establishing trees need to be able to move back and forth in the wind so that they develop their caliper properly. So that's particularly important for those young trees. And the type of material that you use to stake the tree to the, or to attach the tree to the stakes is important too, and I'll show you that in just a second. So here's a picture of a very nicely constructed soil saucer, much nicer than the ones I've ever made, but that's the Cadillac model if you want to do one like that. And you can see the stakes there outside that root ball then. Okay, so mulching then. Mulch has a lot of benefits, but if improperly applied, it can really do a number on your tree as well. One great thing about mulch is that if it is organic mulch, such as shredded bark mulch, it will, as it decays, add good organic matter to the soil. It keeps the soil cool, it keeps the weeds down, and importantly, protects the tree from lawnmower damage. How many times I've seen people have grass right up to the trunk of their tree, and then the bark gets damaged with weed whackers or mowers, disease gets in, and the tree dies. So you definitely want to avoid that. Your mulch ring should go out about 3 inches and it should stop. Sorry, not 3 inches, about 3 feet ideally. You don't need to mulch over the saucer. You can leave the saucer part sticking up so that you can see it. But you should ideally mulch about 3 feet out from the trunk. And again, don't mulch too deep. Don't do this volcano mulching thing. Volcano mulch is really bad because it buries the root flare, and a lot of the trunk creates a barrier to oxygen and water. If you think about it, we get ½ an inch of rain. That's not going to be able to get through that volcano mulch. Also, sometimes the mulch can create excessive moisture. So on the other end of the spectrum, not good. So mulch can be a double-edged sword, and use it appropriately. Finishing up here with staking, pretty much talked through this already. Definitely don't use twine or rope or a rubber hose. You can see when this hose was removed, it had a wire strung through it, and that girdled the bark of the tree there. That's a bad injury for that tree. So this is the type of material that you want to use. You can buy it online. In Madison, I know some of the local garden centers carry it, and so I'm sure that there are other garden centers around the state that carry it as well, if you prefer that. And then watering, make sure with new trees, shrubs, that you water at least 1 inch to 2 inches of water a week for the first 2 growing seasons at least, because establishment takes 2 to 3 years. And in a year like last year, that moisture would be absolutely critical. And you can use various things. You can use a hand hose. If you're on a slope, you may want to use this Ross root feeder. I believe there may be some other brands out there. This just happens to be one I'm familiar with, not recommending it over others. But it attaches to the hose, and it has a long spike that has holes in the base, and you poke that into the ground, and you set your pressure so that it will dribble out and be able to get right down to the root zone. It's particularly helpful in soils that are either dry or on slopes where it's hard to be able to appropriately water the tree. You can also use gator bags if you, for instance, have to go out of town for a week with your new tree. Just make sure and remove that gator bag as soon as you get back, and continue watering appropriately. This is one other thing that I see people sometimes do is the tree comes with tree wrap, and they think they need to leave that on for rabbit protection. You can see that that tree wrap can badly girdle the trunk, so we want to avoid that. For winter protection, you can use caging like hardware cloth, and we do have a very nice video that talks about that exact subject. So thank you very much for attending our mini webinar, and we have more free programs at our website, and I will be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, we are going to get started. We just have a few minutes for questions, but we're going to get started with one that I think is really excellent. And this person is referring to some of the photos and things that you showed about digging the hole. We know it should be wide and shallow, more like not deep and just barely the size of the root ball. But this person said that rather than measuring the root ball depth and then only digging that deep, I have always dug the hole deeper and then backfilled to get the correct depth so that the root flare is at the soil line. So that idea of digging the hole deeper and then backfilling, would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, sure. So that can be a problem because the soil can end up sinking over time, and sometimes it sinks more in one area than another, and then your tree ends up being at kind of an angle. That's why we like you to put it right on the floor of the hole, so that it's not going to go anywhere. Especially if you have like a sandier soil, that could really be a problem.
Thanks, Lisa.
Mhm.
This is a tough one, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. So this person said that they have had a local landscaper, someone that they hired, plant birches, boxwoods last year, as well as some 5 years prior. And cages were left on, burlap was left on. So do you have any thoughts on trying to rectify things that were not done properly, especially around maybe a planting depth or leaving burlap or cages on? Anything we can do after the fact, a year later, 5 years later? What do you have any
Yeah.
advice?
First of all, my sympathies. Make sure that your landscaper takes a look at that fact sheet. It is an unfortunate thing that sometimes happens. The thing that you can best deal with is removing some of that extra mulch. And if you do see any burlap, try and remove that as far down as you can. Now, I think it said before the question went away that was it last year that the boxwoods and the trees were planted?
Yes.
And then there were others that were okay. Yeah, I hate to, after they've been in the ground that long, if it had just been a few weeks ago, you could maybe, dig them up and remove the ropes and burlap and cages and so on. But if it's been a season or more, that's not going to be very easy to do. But again, just get rid of the extra mulch and get rid of any burlap that you can see. If you do happen to see any wire and you can cut that with a good heavy tin snips, anything that you can get rid of will be helpful for those plants.
Thank you,
At least you
Lisa.
have, I assume, a guarantee, but often these things will fail, several years down the line, unfortunately.
All right. Well, we are down to our final minute, but I have one here that is a great question. I always am worried about this. How should I prune roots before planting that might prevent the girdling? You showed some pictures. Can you just give us a really brief recap of what are we trying to do, and should we be afraid of pruning too much roots?
Yeah, I have worked with arborists before, and I have been amazed at the amount of roots that they will sometimes remove. I'm a little bit more conservative than that. Certainly, if you see any roots that are curling back around instead of going out, radiating out like spokes of a wheel, definitely cut those. Do try, though, and preserve as much root material as you can. If you've got balled and burlapped and you can see the first, set of roots coming out from the flare and it looks like they're all going in the appropriate direction, leave it. If you have a bare root plant that you can see there are some issues, you can easily take care of those. And then with the potted trees, if there are circling roots, do break those up.
All right. We are out of time. There was one other question that was just, you mentioned the saucer. Would we mulch just right up to the edge of the saucer? I believe that's what you said.
Yeah, so if your saucer is only 18 inches from the tree, then I would continue mulching on the other side of it. You can leave the soil ring part, the top of it, so you can see where that is, and so that you can continue to fill that with water. But it's best for the tree if it's actually mulched out to the edge of the canopy. But as a minimum, at least mulch it where you have the soil saucer.
All right. Thank you so much. We do need to wrap up now. We went a minute over, but so many great questions and great answers as well. So we have put a link to an evaluation survey in our chat box. And additionally, as the webinar closes, you will be redirected to that survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback on today's program if you wouldn't mind taking a couple minutes and looking at that survey. Thanks again, Lisa, for the excellent presentation. We hope that everyone has gained a few tips and insights into those important steps that you don't want to miss when you're planting your trees to set them up for success. You can find a list of all of our upcoming events on the Extension Horticulture website. That's hort.extension.wisc.edu. Thank you again, Lisa, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you again real soon at another one of our online programs. Have a great day, everyone, and see you next time.